Okay, so this is the second part of the lecture about, oops, okay. This is the second part of the part two of the um, lecture about the ancient Greeks. So, again, these lectures are going to be uploaded to the content. So if you can't attend them in person, that's fine. So last time, um, we let's just sort of review what we talked about last time. So last time, let me share my screen. Oops. Okay. Okay. So last time I started talking about the ancient Greeks whose sculpture sort of set the standard for art for a lot of Europe for a long time. This is the beginning of classicism, you could say. The Romans ended up copying the Greeks, and the Renaissance ended up copying the Romans and the Greeks. So it's pretty important, and that's why we spend a lot of time on the ancient Greeks. Okay, so and this timeline sort of gave you a little bit of perspective into what we were talking, what period in history we're talking about. This is all BCE, before the Common Era. So the last time we were talking about the Archaic period, and today we're going to be talking about the Classical and the Hellenistic periods. So in the Archaic period, you had these kind of stick figure kouros uh, sculptures of the ideal nude male youth. And over time, that sort of evolved to look more realistic and naturalistic as the Greeks got better at understanding anatomy and at making very naturalistic, albeit idealized, representations of this ideal young man who was sort of conflated with a god, really. And in fact, we looked at a sculpture of a god, the god Zeus, who is a middle-aged man, you could say, because he's got a beard, but still idealized, although naturalistic. That is, he's a perfect representation of a male human, you could say. And again, as art historians said, that the athletic male body was sort of the repository for all the Greeks' ideas about what was noble, what was good, what was godlike. They made the gods in their image, you could say. Okay, so again, now this time we're going to be talking about the classical period and the Hellenistic period. So for the purposes of the midterm, what you need to be able to write about in an essay on the midterm, which will have a slide as a prompt, is the differences in the sculpture of the Archaic period, the Classical period, and the Hellenistic period. Like, how did it change over time? So I hope you're watching the lectures. You really will not be able to answer that question without watching the lectures and watching them from beginning to end, not ending after 15 minutes. And you should be taking notes during the lecture as well. And you should be looking at some of the videos in the content about the ancient Greeks. Okay, so by the time of the classical period, um, the Greek world was sort of centered on Athens. That was the most powerful and wealthy city-state of the Greek city-states, which were all independent entities. Greece was not a united nation state. And under Pericles, the leader of Athens in the 5th century, the Athenians really went on a kind of building and spending spree where they uh, made this spectacular monument on the top of their Acropolis. So an Acropolis is a hill in a city, originally a kind of fortified hill that you ran away to when the Spartans came or whatever. But by the time of the 5th century BCE, it had become a religious precinct, a kind of spiritual area for for the Greeks, or for the Athenians in particular. And they built a temple to their patroness goddess, Athena, for whom the city was named, on the top of the Acropolis. And this is the Parthenon, um, named for Athena Parthenos. So Athena is called Parthenos because she sprang from the head of Zeus. She was not born. Whoa. Somebody needs to turn off their. Y'all need to mute yourselves. Somebody does. I'll mute you. Okay. All right. So yeah. So this oops, getting ahead of myself a little bit. All right. So the Parthenon is a ruin now. It doesn't. It's kind of been restored, but when you visit it, you can see that the roof has been blown off. The sculpture that decorated it is pretty much gone, but that some of that sculpture still survives in museums, and we're going to look at it during this lecture. This lecture is really mostly about sculpture. Okay, so here's the Acropolis in Athens. The architects of the Acropolis are actually, we know their names, Ictinus and Callicrates. They were the architects. They designed this area at the top of this mountain in Athens. There's still the ruins of some of the other buildings that were part of this building complex there, in addition to the Parthenon, but the Parthenon was the main important building. Okay, so as you may know, there's actually a Parthenon in Nashville, and it's in much better condition. It was built for the Nashville Centennial celebration, thus it's in Centennial Park. In the late 19th century, it was originally made out of plaster, but then a cement or concrete version was created to be more permanent because people liked it so much. So when you visit the Parthenon in Nashville, clearly it's not the same experience as you're going to have in Athens because it's not on a mountain. It's just in Centennial Park. It's not made out of marble, but you can get a pretty good sense of what it might have been like to visit the Parthenon in Athens when it was new. That is, it's built to the same scale, and it's an exact model or replica of the original Parthenon, except made out of different materials and in Nashville instead of in Athens, Greece. So you may have heard that Nashville is called the Athens of the South, and now you know why, because of, well, I'm looking for my clock here. I want to keep track of the time. Because of the Parthenon, and also because there's so many universities in Nashville. So it's like Athens in that people used to come from all over the South to be educated in Nashville, and Athens was also a center for education. Now, one thing that we have in Nashville that they don't have in Greece is we have an Athena. So the original monumental sculpture of Athena that was in the Parthenon in Athens is long gone. It was probably melted down because it was made out of gold and ivory. It was made out of precious materials, and eventually the Athenians must have destroyed it in order to pay for another war or something, who knows. But it's not present anymore, and it's been gone for a very long time. I don't know how. Okay, this is Alan LeQuire. He's the sculptor that created the Nashville replica of what we think the original Athena looked like. And I'm not really sure how they know what the original Athena in Athens looked like. Maybe there were written descriptions of her, but somehow, based on some research, Alan Lequire came up with this design that was supposed to be reasonably accurate. It's certainly at the right scale. So the original Athena, the goddess, patron goddess of Athens, had this little mini me on her hand called Athena Nike. And Athena Nike was a little goddess with wings who represented victory. She's sometimes called the winged victory. So, victory over who? Well, mainly the Persians. So, when we get to the video, the art historians will explain about the Persians and why they were the enemy of the Greeks and how the Greeks sort of amazingly defeated the Persians, which were a much larger force army, and how that affected the Athenians' view of themselves. Okay, so Athena is a warrior goddess, and she has this shield with a snake on it, and she has a big spear, and sometimes she's wearing armor. And I don't think this is real gold, the one in Nashville, but the original one was called chryselephantine. That is, it was made out of gold and ivory. This one is made out of some kind of polymer that's not ivory. That would be really bad if a bunch of elephants had to be killed to make this. And some kind of gold-like material. Okay, so this is a plan of the Parthenon. A plan means when you're looking down on a building, like from a drone or something, and the roof has been taken off. So you can see how the rooms are arranged. All right, so the room where the giant Athena statue was is called the Naos. It's on the east end of the Parthenon building. And the Sekos at the west end is where the treasury was kept. So the Parthenon was not a temple in the sense that there were like church services there every Sunday or anything like that. It was just the home of the goddess. And people worshiped, the Greeks worshiped outside. So they would have an outdoor altar where they sacrificed animals and so on. The structure of the Parthenon was built to house the statue of the goddess, and also back here to house the treasury, that is the gold, the silver, the jewels, the sort of booty that the Athenians were supposedly safeguarding for the rest of the Greeks in case the Persians came back. But instead, the Athenians used a lot of that treasure to build the Acropolis, basically, to decorate their own city. And then around here is the colonnade on the porch that sort of surrounds the Parthenon. Okay, that's all interesting, but mainly what we're talking about here in this lecture is the sculptural program for the Parthenon, because it was decorated out the wazoo with sculpture. Okay, so there was a sculpture in the pediment, which is the triangular sort of gables at the end of each end of the Parthenon. There was sculpture on the metopes, these squares underneath the pediment and on the sides of the Parthenon. And then on the interior wall, there was a frieze spelled like this that depicted the Panathenaic procession, which was this annual event where everybody came up to the Parthenon and made offerings to the goddess Athena, like a huge sort of Mardi Gras. Okay, so when you approach the Parthenon, you approach it from the west first. And so what you see under the west pediment, that is the end of the Parthenon, which is triangular shaped under the roof, is this what you once saw was this amazing sculpture depicting the battle between Athena and Poseidon to see who would be the patron god of Athens. And then there's all these other goddesses and gods witnessing this contest. And it wasn't really a battle. The contest was that Athena was going to give a gift to the city of Athens, and Poseidon gave a gift to the city of Athens. And Poseidon's gift was a spring on the Acropolis, that from which flowed delicious water. And Athena's gift to the people of Athens was an olive tree. And Athena won. The olive tree was thought to be better than the spring. And so she won, and she's the patron goddess of Athens. So most of these sculptures did not survive all the bad things that happened to the Parthenon. So the bad things that happened, actually it lasted about 2,000 years until about the year 1600, when the Turks, who were then in control of Athens, stored gunpowder in the Parthenon. And the gunpowder, then they were in a war with the Venetians, and the Venetians, shame on them, shelled the Parthenon, and of course the gunpowder blew up. And so all the sculpture went kablooey all over the Acropolis, and not much of the West Pediment survived, except this sculpture of a goddess called Iris. They think that's who this is meant to represent. Okay, the East Pediment, though, survived somewhat better, the sculpture under the East Pediment. So when you approach the Parthenon, you would come up to the west side first, and then walk on either side of the Parthenon, and then come to the east entrance where you entered the sanctuary where the giant statue of Athena was. So this sculptural program on the East Pediment shows the birth of Athena. And Athena was not born in the normal way. She, instead of being born a baby and coming out of her mother, she was born full grown, and she leaped from the head of her father, and that was Zeus. Okay, so here's Zeus, and here's Athena, and she just leapt out of his head, fully armed. So the gods on either side who have witnessed this amazing event are like, oh my God, what just happened? So they're all going like this, which I think I would too if I saw a fully armed woman jumping out of the head of a man. Some of this sculpture survives. So yeah, here's some of it. Okay, so all this sculpture that we're looking at, the pediment sculpture, is not in Athens anymore. It's in the British Museum in London. And that happened because an English lord, Lord Elgin, went to Greece and saw this sculpture lying around and said, hey, could I take this back to England with me? And apparently he got permission from the Greek government to take it back to England. So he did. And they installed it at the British Museum there. So that's where I saw it. I've seen it once, I think, in 1972. And then I went back to the British Museum in 94, but I never made it to the Elgin Marbles room. The Greek government has been trying to get these sculptures back, but so far they have not been successful. They're still in the British Museum. Okay, so as you can see, this sculpture that survived is from the left end of the triangle, and it depicts the sun god, Helios, driving his chariot above the horizon at dawn. And it shows the god Dionysus and then some goddesses sort of reacting to the birth of Athena in the center of the pediment. But that part of the sculpture is lost. And then on the other side, on the right-hand side of the pediment, we see three reclining goddesses with this amazing drapery, really, flowing over their bodies. And, you know, we talked about earlier about how the Kouros, the male sculptures, were usually nude, but the female sculptures, female figures in sculpture were almost always clothed. But you can see here that they might as well be nude. The drapery reveals as much as it covers. It's very thin linen, almost, it looks like it's just clinging to their bodies. And you can see the beautiful, the amazing ability of Phidias, the sculptor, who did the sculpture for the Parthenon. The amazing ability that he and his assistants had in rendering something as soft as cloth, but in marble. I mean, it's incredible. And this is called the Phidian style, this flowing drapery. And then at the very far end to the right of the pediment sculpture is this wonderful horse, and the head of this horse, and he represents the chariot of the moon. Okay, so when the sun comes up at the full moon is setting in the west. The sun is coming up in the east, the moon is setting in the west. And so this is the horse that pulls the chariot of the moon. And you can see he's been pulling the chariot all night long, so he's exhausted. There's a replica of this horse's head in the Parthenon Museum in Nashville. So if you go there, you can get up close to it and get a better look at it. Okay, so in addition to the pediment sculpture, there's also, let me just review you what the metopes are. The metope sculpture. Okay, so the metopes are these squares separated by 3 little bars, which are called triglyphs, underneath the pediment and around the edge of the Parthenon. So these were done a little earlier than the pediment sculpture, so their style is slightly different, and they depict a different story, at least the ones that survive. There were several stories depicted in the metopes, but the ones that survived are mostly about this battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. So the Lapiths are Greeks, humans, and the Centaurs are centaurs, half man, half horse. And so the story is that the Lapiths were having a wedding, and they're a tribe of ancient Greeks. And the Lapiths made the mistake of inviting the centaurs who lived in the woods to this wedding. And the centaurs weren't used to drinking wine. They drank too much. They tried to abduct the Lapith women, and a battle ensued. So, but in reality, that's the story on the surface, but the real meaning, according to art historians, is the battle between barbarism and civilization. And in other words, the Lapiths represent the civilized Greeks, the artistic, literate, mathematically sophisticated Greeks, and barbarians like the centaurs, who are just basically animals. And they think that the centaurs were supposed to be kind of a stand-in for the Persians, who were the great enemy of the Greeks, the Persian Empire, which was huge. And the Greeks had just succeeded a few years prior to this in defeating the Persians, amazingly, despite the fact that the Persians had this huge empire and huge army. The tiny Greek army defeated them, and the Persians just gave up and went home. All right, so these depictions of the centaurs and the Lapiths, their battle, is sort of a allegory or metaphor for the battle of the Greeks against all the barbarians in their world. So clearly, this centaur is a barbarian. The Greek had on a woven cloak of some sort made on a loom, but the centaur is just wearing an animal skin, like a primitive person. In this case, the centaur is kind of beat up the Lapith, and the Lapith is dead or dying, but still his body is just beautiful. It's very, it's an ideal sort of athletic Greek body. And similarly here. Now, one thing to note is that these sculptures are not in very good shape. Like a lot of the sculptures on the Parthenon, the heads fell off sometime in the last 2,500 years. These were carved in high relief. That is, they are stuck to a background nominally, but the arms and heads stuck out like sculpture in the round, which the pediment sculptures are, and they were painted, of course, like all Greek sculpture. So in this case, again, the head of the Greek and the head of the centaur fell off 1,000 years ago or something. But you can still see what a wonderful sculpture this was. There's this sort of wonderful asymmetrical balance between the centaur's, the bending back of the centaur and the bend in the lapith's body and the directional force going this way and the directional force going this way. And then the whole thing sort of held together and framed by the lapith's cloak that he has sort of elegantly draped over his arm. And it's really, the other thing that I think is incredible about these sculptures is the fact that it's so believable that there could be a half man, half horse. Like, of course, nobody's ever seen a centaur, but the sculptors could imagine the fusion of a man and a horse in a way that makes it completely believable. Okay, so now we're going on to another part of the sculpture on the Parthenon, and that is the frieze, spelled F-R-I-E-Z-E, not normal frieze like what your freezer does. So the frieze just means a low relief sculpture that is, this only sticks out 2 or 3 inches. There are some places where it's broken, but it survived kind of better because it's like a drawing on stone. It's not high relief like this, it's low relief. So, and again, it was painted. All right, so what is the frieze about? The frieze is about what was called the Panathenaic procession, which means the procession of all of Athens. On one day of the year, everybody in Athens would join a procession that would go up the steps of the Acropolis to the temple to Athena and present a new robe to the ancient olive wood statue of Athena, not the chryselephantine one, but an older one that was made out of wood. They would present her with a new peplos, a new dress, basically. And this was both a very solemn religious occasion and also a kind of huge party. And so these are the horses that are some of the horses that are in the procession going up to the Parthenon to bring the offerings. And there were bridles and reins originally attached to these sculptures. But you can see how incredibly beautiful the bodies of both the horses and the riders are, and the incredible naturalism of these sculptures. I mean, Phidias and his assistants had totally nailed horse anatomy and human anatomy to a degree that's incredible and really beautiful. So at the beginning, you see the frieze when you walk under the porch. That is, you go under between these columns and you look up, and there's the frieze right up here. So again, the beautiful and noble Athenian youths are leading their horses up onto the Acropolis. And then as the procession continues down the side of the Parthenon building, it sort of speeds up. And at times, you can see multiple riders overlapping here. 3 horses, 3 riders. And their hooves and feet are all kind of intermingled, but it all makes sense. This horse is behind this horse, which is behind this horse. And the Athenians sit on their horses with a kind of calmness that contrasts with the kind of wild expression on the faces of the horses. Again, this is thought to be a kind of metaphor for the Greeks' control over nature and over their own selves. So the Greeks considered themselves to be very rational, scientific, logical people who understood the universe better than anybody in the world, and there was some truth to that. And that they were sort of in control of their own selves and of nature. And this is shown in their kind of mastery of these horses. So at one end of the frieze, the gods are seated, and you can tell they're gods because they're bigger than the people in the frieze, and they're seated awaiting the arrival of the offerings for the goddess. Okay, so this is a painting from the 19th century where an artist imagined what it might have looked like when Phidias, standing here, unveiled his amazing achievement here. And the artist imagines that the Athenians built a kind of platform so that you could go up a ladder and get right up next to the sculptures. I mean, in normal life, this scaffold wouldn't be there. You would have to look up, to see the frieze, but it would be painted. And it would have gold and bronze fittings for the harness and all that stuff. So it would have been pretty shiny and pretty easy to see from the ground. But nevertheless, maybe the Athenians all came up on this scaffold and had a good look at the sculptures, which were painted. The paint has worn off over the centuries, but okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to watch a video about this. Stop share. And again, it's getting to the point in the course where you really need to start studying the Khan Academy videos that are linked to in your content. Sometimes I have time to show some of these videos during the lecture, but you should definitely go back and watch them on your own and take notes from these, because this is what you're going to need during the midterm test.
High atop the natural fortification that is the Acropolis in Athens is the sacred center of the city and some of the most celebrated buildings in all of Western history. The most famous is the Parthenon, dedicated to the virgin goddess Athena.
We're talking about the 5th century BCE in ancient Athens. This is a period we refer to as the classical period, the high point of Greek culture. And all of this comes right after an important Greek victory over the Persian Empire.
The Persians controlled an enormous area. Athens, and in fact all of Greece, which was then divided into a series of distinct city-states, was tiny in comparison. But miraculously, Athens was able to decisively defeat the Persians in 479 BCE.
For many art historians, the classical period of ancient Greece is a result of the incredible optimism and confidence, some would say overconfidence, of the Athenians in this period after the defeat of the Persians.
And the Parthenon is often seen as a physical embodiment of that confidence. And while the building was constructed, the sculptures, which are every bit as important as the building itself, took a few more years to finish.
So we're here in the British Museum, which houses, together with the Acropolis Museum in Athens and a few sculptures in the Louvre, the vast majority of sculpture that was made for the Parthenon. These were overseen by the famous sculptor Phidias, and sometimes we refer to the style of the sculpture that we see here as Phidian. There are 3 primary locations where we find sculpture on the Parthenon. Most obviously in the pediment, the triangular area at the very top of the temple, on both the east and west sides. Below that, there are spaces called metopes in between triglyphs. And lastly, in the frieze, that is a band of continuous sculpture. The Parthenon is an interesting building because it combines both Doric and Ionic elements. The triglyphs and metopes are typical Doric elements, while the frieze is considered a typical element of Ionic temples.
What we're seeing here in London, or the examples in Athens or in Paris, are marbles that have lost all their color. And it's important to remember that all of these sculptures would have been very high up, but were originally brightly colored, and this would have helped their visibility. And that's especially true for the frieze, which would have been atop the interior colonnade, and so would have been seen in shadow.
When the Athenians approached the Parthenon, on top of the Acropolis, they approached the west side and walked around either the north or south sides to the east, where the entrance was.
And that means that they would have seen the west pediment first, and then the east pediment. This building is 2,500 years old and it has suffered terribly, and so has the sculpture. And so what we're seeing is the result of a terrible abuse that this building has suffered over many centuries.
In many ways, we're lucky that anything survives for us to look at. So let's start with the rest pediment. The subject there is the competition between Poseidon and Athena to be the patron deity of the city of Athens.
But we know who wins, because the city is named after Athena. And sadly, almost nothing survives from the west pediment.
On the east pediment, the story of the birth of Athena.
And so right in the center of the pediment, at its tallest point, would have been the god Zeus giving birth to his daughter Athena, who was born full-grown from his head.
Sadly, those central figures are lost. What we have on either side are the figures who were present, some of whom are reacting to the birth of Athena.
The pediment is traditionally read from left to right, and it begins with the dawn, with the god Helios at his chariot, representing the rising sun.
Athena was born at sunrise, so this makes sense.
The baseline of the pediment functions as a horizon line. It's a brilliant interpretation of this space, and it allows us to imagine the figures rising up.
And then we have the gods and goddesses on Mount Olympus, present for the birth of Athena.
One of the figures that is in the best condition is the nude figure that we think is likely the god Dionysus, the god of wine. And if it is, he looks like he is appropriately lounging, perhaps with a cup of wine in his hand.
That Greek love of the human body, particularly the male nude, and the articulation of the anatomy and the muscles of the body.
And while we see this figure at rest, the artist has been careful to represent his body in such a way that we know his strength.
As we approach the middle of the pediment where we would have seen the birth of Athena, it appears as though there's some acknowledgement of the action that's taking place in the center of the pediment. We have a standing figure who seems to be moving away as though in surprise at the event that's taking place.
And the figure to her left, even though the head has been lost, seems taken aback. She seems to be directly reacting. Her body seems to be jerking away. And so there is the sense of the momentary.
Dionysus and the other seated figure perhaps haven't yet noticed the momentous event of the birth of Athena.
On the right side, we have the famous group, the three goddesses. And here we see the Greeks' extraordinary ability to render not only the human body, but the forms of clothing that both obscure and reveal the body below it. For example, in the figure at the right, who is reclining, if you look at the way that the cloth wraps around her upper thigh, it is bunched up, and so we know the thigh is far below that cloth. At the same time, the torsion of that cloth reveals the musculature underneath.
But this isn't the way that drapery really looks. This is the Phidian style that we associate with this classical moment in ancient Greece, where the drapery acts almost like water flowing around the body.
Some of it is carved very deeply, so you get these black, rich shadows. There's a nobility and a sense of luxury. These are beings without care. And then finally, at the extreme right corner, we have this brilliant form of a horse's head.
And so on one side we have the rising of the day with Helios and his chariot. Here we have the end of the day with the goddess of the moon.
And whereas the horses at dawn are full of energy, and here the horse looks exhausted. Its mouth, its nostrils seem almost to be resting on the edge of the building.
Just below the pediment, we find a band occupied by Triglass and Metopes. And on each of the four sides, we find four mythic battles.
So each side of the building represents its own story. And here at the British Museum, the Lapiths against the Centaurs. And all four of these stories are really stand-ins for the way that the Greeks saw themselves in relationship to their enemy, the Persians. That is, that the Greeks stood for civilization, for order, and the Persians to the east represented a kind of disorder, a kind of chaos, and barbarism.
The story between the Lapiths and the Centaurs begins at a wedding, where the Centaurs had too much to drink.
They weren't used to drinking at all, and they decided to make off with the Lapith women. What we're seeing is the battle that resulted. In several of the metopes, the centaurs are victorious. In one extraordinary metope, we see a Lapith who has been killed by a centaur. The centaur rises up on his hind legs in victory, and the Lapith, whose body is so beautifully rendered, lies below. The body, even in its damaged state, shows the nobility of the Greeks and the Greeks' love for the human body.
In another metope, we see the victorious Lapith, who's got a centaur by the neck, pulling him back, while the centaur himself seems to be reaching to his back, perhaps to a wound inflicted by the lapith. And what I'm struck by in both of these metopes is the way that the figures almost break the bound of the metope, creating diagonal forms that have an incredible amount of energy.
Look at how the beauty of the torso is highlighted against the rhythmic folds of the drape behind. This is clearly fiction. In the middle of battle, you don't have a perfectly splayed drape. But for the sculptor, the subject was clearly the beauty of the body. Look at the way the lapith's left leg pushes out at a diagonal as he tries to get a foothold to help support him as he pulls back the centaur's body, almost like it was a bow. You get a sense of the enormous energy that's being expended here.
The center of this composition is empty, and the figures frame that center, creating these arcs that pull against one another.
This particular lapith is virtually a freestanding sculpture, but the Parthenon is also rightly known for a shallower relief sculpture. It would have been seen not on the outside of the temple, but just inside the exterior columns.
So let's go have a look at the justly famous frieze from the Parthenon. We should say that no one is entirely certain what the frieze represents, but there is a general consensus that the frieze represents the Pan-Athenaic procession. That is an important yearly procession that went up the Sacred Way to the Acropolis in honor of the goddess Athena.
And the procession would make its way to one of the most sacred objects in all of Athens, an ancient olive wood statue of the goddess Athena. This is extraordinarily rare. In almost every other ancient Greek temple context, we see images from Greek mythology. We don't see representations of Greeks of their own day.
What we're seeing is an idealized image of the Athenians as though they projected themselves into the realm of the gods. And we know that the Athenians were incredibly self-confident. They had defeated the Persians against all odds, and so this surely must have something to do with the way they imagined themselves on the frieze.
Close to the beginning of the frieze, on the west front, we see preparations for the procession. Look at the two figures on horseback. Look how easily they ride on those horses that seem full of energy.
The figure on the right pulls his horse back and leans back himself. The figure on the left turns back to look at him as his horse gallops forward. The naturalism in the movement here is an amazing artistic achievement.
This would have been brightly painted, and in fact the background would have been a brilliant blue.
And there were also metal attachments where appropriate.
And in fact you can see 3 holes across the head of the horse on the right, which would have originally held the bridle.
Look at the figures. Their bodies are ideal and athletic. They move easily.
There's also great attention to the structures of the body itself. The people who carved this stone understood the musculature, understood the bone structure of the human body. There are 60 horses on both the north and the south side. There's incredible variety and rhythm as these horses overlap and move across this ribbon of stone.
Look at the overlapping legs of the horses. You can almost hear them galloping. But as animated as the horses are, the men themselves seem calm and noble.
We're seeing almost all of their faces in perfect profile, which the Greeks believed was the most noble way of representing the face. Their mouths are closed as a representation of their sense of calm and control. And these were attributes that the Greeks revered. And here, like on the metopiece, we're seeing an expression of the Greeks' ability to control nature, to control these powerful animals.
The next group that we see are charioteers. And actually, there was a chariot competition as part of the Pan-Athenaic procession.
In addition to the chariots, there are animals that are being brought for sacrifice. Now, as we wrap around the building towards the east end, the energy that had existed with the horsemen calms and slows, and we have a series of women who walk solemnly forward. We see large seated figures. These are the gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus, but interspersed with smaller representations.
Okay, so I'm going to let you watch the rest of that on your own, and you should. Don't skip that. It's going to be important. Okay, now back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so after the classical period ends in Greece, we have a period called the Hellenistic period, where Greek, and Hellenistic just means Greek-like. and it was not just in Greece. The Hellenistic art period occurs all over the Aegean Sea and into the Mediterranean. That is in Italy, on the coast of Turkey. So there were all these city-states that were Greek culturally and linguistically, but the Greeks themselves didn't really control them anymore. By that time, the Roman Empire had become more powerful in the Mediterranean area, but still the Romans adored Greek sculpture and they copied its style and subject matter. And so, for example, in this sculpture, the Dying Gaul, it's a Roman marble copy of a lost Greek bronze sculpture. So it was originally cast in bronze, and the Romans copied it in marble. So not only is this like a different time period politically and culturally, but the sculpture itself began to change, the style of the sculpture. So whereas in the classical period, the figures are very calm, very serene, and idealized, by the time, and if they were an enemy, they were portrayed as an animal, literally, like the Greeks' enemies, the Persians, and so on, were portrayed as barbaric, animal-like figures. By the time of the Hellenistic period, sculptors were starting to represent the Greeks' enemies as human for once. So a Gaul was basically a Celtic person. So the Celtic tribes, I have a slide of this. All right, so the Celtic tribes of Northern Europe began to expand out of Northern and Central Europe into Italy and into the Greek world. So the Greek world is this kind of purple area that included actual Greece, parts of Italy, and the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And the Gauls, or the Celtic people, had a different language, different culture. They began to expand in the 6th to 3rd century BC out of their original home in Germany and France and so on, and to sort of come down into Southern Europe almost first as kind of raiders or invaders. And so they were the enemies of the Greeks. They were barbarians that were invading the Greek world and sacking their cities and stealing their wine and all that kind of stuff. So this represents one of their enemies, an invading Gaul. And how do we know that? Because the sculptor has created the sort of hairstyle of the Gauls, which was a kind of spiky, teased up hairstyle, and then these torques that men and women wore around their necks, made out of precious metals, and facial hair, mustaches, which the Greeks and Romans normally didn't always have, but the Celtic warriors usually did. So there's a video about this sculpture in the content, and you should watch it because it talks about these stylistic changes. That is, portraying the enemy as human for once, and also the kind of emotion and pathos that was previously lacking in classical sculpture is predominant in Hellenistic sculpture. And this is a prime example. Okay, this is like if you were only going to learn about one Hellenistic sculpture for a 300-year period of art, this would be it. This is the most Hellenistic sculpture ever. Okay, so what makes it Hellenistic? Well, the pathos, the emotion, the drama. Okay, so here's the story. The priest Laocoon, this is a story from the Trojan War, which happened, 2,000 years before the sculpture was ever made. But in the Trojan War, the Greeks, their last sort of trick, as you probably know, was the Trojan horse, where they built this big wooden horse and they hid inside it and they waited for the Trojans to open the gate and pull the horse inside the gate, and then they jumped out and killed everybody. So Laocoon, the Trojan priest, warned the Trojans to beware of Greeks bearing gifts. I'm sure you've heard that expression, or maybe you have. Anyway, so he said, don't accept this Trojan, this horse thing, this wooden horse, because it's a trick. And as a result, the god Poseidon, who was on the side of the Greeks, was furious at Laocoon for giving away the trick, and he sent these terrifying serpents like Burmese pythons or something out of the ocean to kill Laocoon and his two sons. So you have this horrible scene of a man and his two sons being attacked by two snakes. So why do I say two snakes? Well, one of the heads is here, and then the other snake body is here, and I think the head got broken off at some point. So there's also a video in the Khan Academy content about this sculpture that you should watch. One of the most important things to notice about it is just the diagonal kind of twisting of the figures. Laocoon himself is twisted in a very diagonal pose, and then there's just all this twisting of the snakes themselves. It's part of the sort of serpentine style of Hellenistic sculpture. And it was lost. This sculpture was described by Pliny, a writer from the classical era, a Roman writer, and then it disappeared. It was unearthed in the 1500s in Italy during Michelangelo's lifetime. And Michelangelo identified it because he recognized it from the writings of Pliny. So it became extremely important to Michelangelo and to other Renaissance sculptors. Classical sculpture in general was important to them, but especially this one. So again, we don't have time to go over in depth all of the things that you need to learn about. You have to sort of take some initiative here and not only read the text, but explore some of the content in the eLearn part of your course and take notes from those videos so that when you go to write the essay on the midterm, you won't have to search around for information. You should just be able to turn right to your notes and write the essay from that. So I know this may not be what most people sort of expect from a college course, but that's actually how college works. The lectures are just as important as the text. The lecture presents additional material from the professor's own research that's not in the text. So we expect that you can read your text, and then we're going to tell you about our own research, things that we have learned as scholars, and that's what we present in the lectures. So that's why it's important to take notes in the lecture. And it's also important to study on your own the content in the modules in your eLearn course. So the text, the lectures, and the videos in the eLearn content, those are your three main sources of information, and you need all three. You can't just rely on the text. You can't just watch 15 minutes of the lecture and say, okay, I'm done. You can't skip the videos and the content. So you should be spending between 3 and 6 hours a week on this course if you want to get an A. And the minimum is really 3. So if you have any questions about that, you can email me and I'd be glad to explain it further. So I'm going to stop recording now.